The 15th doctor stepped back from the gurney and said the words no one in that trauma bay wanted to hear. There's nothing more we can do. 15 physicians, 2 hours, and a soldier lying there with blood still warm on his chest, heart monitor slipping toward a line that didn't move. That was the moment Emily Hart, suspended, humiliated, officially ordered out of this building, pushed past the doorframe and leaned down close to the dying man's ear. Nobody stopped her fast enough. She pressed her mouth near his temple and said one word, a single word, barely above a whisper, and his hand moved. But the person who looked most alarmed in that room wasn't relieved. He looked like someone who'd just watched a secret walk back from the dead. Hello, everyone. If you're watching this story, stay with me until the very last minute, because this is one you won't be able to look away from. Hit the like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments right below. I want to know how far my story has traveled across this world. The suspension notice had been printed on hospital letterhead, which felt deliberate, official. Like someone wanted her to understand exactly how permanent this was supposed to be. Emily Hart stood in the hallway outside Administrator Gail Pruitt's office and read it twice, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because she was trying to figure out which part of it she was angrier about, the language or the fact that it had been delivered by a 23-year-old HR assistant who couldn't hold eye contact for more than 2 seconds. Conduct unbecoming of clinical staff. Insubordination toward supervising physician. Effective immediately. She folded it once, tucked it into her scrub pocket, and walked back toward the locker room. Around her, the morning shift at Iron Ridge Medical Center moved the way it always did. Monitors beeping, wheels rolling across linoleum, someone calling out a bed number 2 hallways over. The hospital didn't notice her. That was the thing about Iron Ridge. It was big enough that one person's bad morning just got absorbed into everything else. She had 26 minutes left on her shift when it happened. Dr. Malcolm Vey had come into Bay 4 at 6:12 a.m. for what was supposed to be a routine post-op check on a 61-year-old man recovering from abdominal surgery. Emily had been there already, updating the chart, when she noticed the medication order Vey had written the night before. Ketorolac, 30 milligrams IV. On a patient with a documented history of renal impairment and a creatinine level that had been climbing for 2 days. She said something. That was the whole of it. She said something. Dr. Vey, I want to flag this order before it goes through. His kidney function has been trending down since Tuesday. The dose? I can read a chart, Ms. Hart. I know you can. I just want to make sure the renal clearance is factored in before... Are you questioning my clinical judgment? She had paused then, because she knew what the right answer was supposed to be. She knew the rhythm of these moments, the way you were expected to soften, to qualify, to make the attending feel like they'd come to the right conclusion themselves. She'd watched other nurses do it for years. It was a skill, a form of institutional survival. Yes, she said, in this specific case, I am. That was apparently the wrong answer. Vey had called Pruitt within the hour. By 7:15, Emily was holding the folded paper. By 7:40, she was standing in front of her locker trying to decide if she wanted coffee before she drove home or if she just wanted to leave. She got the coffee. That was the decision that changed everything, though she didn't know it yet. The hospital had a small canteen on the ground floor near the ambulance bay, and Emily sat there with a paper cup she wasn't really drinking, still in her scrubs because she hadn't bothered to change, watching the morning traffic outside the window. She was tired in the way that went past the body, the kind of tired that settles somewhere behind your sternum and makes everything feel slightly too loud. She'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 years. 3 years of watching things get ordered wrong and flagged right, and then argued about in hallways by people with better titles and worse instincts. She wasn't angry about the suspension, exactly. She was angry about the patient in Bay 4 who was going to get that medication because she was no longer in the building to push back. She pulled out her phone and was halfway through typing a message to the charge nurse, Yvonne, who was reasonable, who would listen, when she heard the radio crackle from the paramedic staging area 20 feet away. Trauma incoming, multiple casualties, military personnel, ETA 6 minutes. She put the phone down. She told herself she was just going to move to a better seat. The canteen chairs were close to the window, and she'd have a clear line of sight to the ambulance bay, and she was just going to finish her coffee. She told herself that twice. The first ambulance came in fast, no lights, which was unusual. Usually the sirens started announcing themselves from 3 blocks out. This one arrived quietly, like it was trying not to be noticed, which was a thing that ambulances were not supposed to do and which made Emily set down her cup. 2 military SUVs had pulled in ahead of it, black, no markings, which wasn't the same as no markings. It just meant the markings were the kind that took a second to see. She recognized the configuration without being able to explain how she recognized it. Some knowledge doesn't come from thinking. It comes from having stood in dusty vehicle staging areas in places where mistakes meant body bags instead of paperwork. The gurney came out fast. Emily was already moving toward the doors before she'd made a decision to move. The man on the gurney was big, 6'2", maybe 6'3", and built like someone who had spent years carrying weight uphill. His uniform was field stripped down to the base layer, and there was a pressure bandage on his left side that had already soaked through twice based on the color. Head trauma, she cataloged automatically. Thoracic involvement, possible. The way his right arm was positioned suggested something neurological was happening or had happened recently. She pushed through the ER entrance behind the gurney team and stopped just inside the doorway. The trauma bay was already filling. 2 attendings, a resident, 3 nurses, respiratory therapy. The kind of response that meant someone had called ahead, had told them this mattered. Military badge on one of the men in civilian clothes near the door. She clocked it without staring. Special operations liaison, probably. The kind of person who showed up when the patient was carrying more than a medical file. She stood at the edge of the room and watched. The lead attending was Dr. Patricia Osei, who was good. Genuinely good. Not just competent, which at Iron Ridge was not always the same thing. Osei worked fast and asked sharp questions and didn't waste motion. Emily respected her, but Osei was working with what she had, which was a patient whose neurological responses kept flickering in ways that didn't fit the pattern the chart was building. Emily watched the monitor. She watched his hands. She noticed something. The index finger on his right hand had moved twice in the last 90 seconds in a way that wasn't a spasm. It was too deliberate for a spasm, too structured. It was a movement she had seen before, in a context so far removed from this hospital corridor that it felt like memory from someone else's life. She had been 24 years old, in a forward operating base in an area she was still not supposed to name, when she had first watched a combat medic run a recovery protocol on a special operations soldier who had presented in almost exactly this configuration. The protocol had a name. She wasn't supposed to know the name. Technically, the name shouldn't have survived her separation from service. There were things you carried out of that world that weren't in any paperwork, and they lived in your body instead of in your files. She crossed the room before she thought it through. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one of the nurses started. "I know him," Emily said. She didn't, actually, not personally, but the lie came out with enough certainty that it bought her 4 more steps. She reached the gurney and bent close to the soldier's ear and said one word. "Nightfall." His hand moved. Not a spasm. Not a reflex. His fingers curled and released in a pattern she recognized as acknowledgement. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. The specific quality of silence that happens when a group of professionals all register something they don't have language for yet. Behind her, someone moved toward the door. She didn't turn to look. She cataloged the sound of footsteps, the pace of them, the direction. Whoever had just moved had moved toward the exit, not toward the patient. That was the first thing that struck her as wrong. "Get her out of here," Dr. Malcolm Vey's voice came from the doorway. Emily hadn't heard him come in, which meant he'd arrived quickly. Too quickly for someone who'd just been doing rounds on the surgical floor. She straightened and turned. He was standing at the threshold of the trauma bay in his white coat, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her 4 hours ago, like she was a problem he'd already solved and was annoyed to find still present. "She's suspended," he said, to nobody in particular and everybody at once. "Security needs to remove her from this floor." Dr. Osei looked between them. "Malcolm, we're in the middle of a..." "She doesn't have privileges. She doesn't have a badge. She needs to be escorted out." He walked in and positioned himself between Emily and the gurney in a way that was deliberate, not incidental. Whatever she just did, it needs to be documented. "What she just did," said the man near the door, the military liaison, who had been quiet until now, produced a neurological response in a patient who had been showing minimal activity for the last 40 minutes, So maybe we hold off on the escort for 60 seconds. Vey looked at him. Something shifted in his face, a recalibration, fast and almost invisible. This is a clinical matter. Civilian hospital protocols. I understand the protocols, doctor. The liaison's voice hadn't changed tone at all. And I'm asking for 60 seconds. Vey's jaw tightened. He stepped back, not because he wanted to, because the alternative was making a scene in front of someone he couldn't immediately read. And whatever Malcolm Vey was, he was not stupid. Emily moved back to the gurney. She leaned toward Captain Hale. She didn't know his name yet, but she would learn it later. And when she did, it would feel like she'd always known it. And she watched his eyes. They were partially open now, not focused, but present in a way they hadn't been before. "Can you hear me?" she said quietly, the faintest tightening around his eyes. "Yes." "Are you tracking?" She used the phrasing deliberately, military language, because that was what he would respond to. The fingers moved again. Same pattern. She turned to Ose. His responses are voluntary. He's locked in, not unresponsive. He needs a different protocol. The standard GCS assessment is going to underestimate him. Ose studied her for a moment. "You have a background in this?" "Army, combat medicine, attached to special ops units for most of my service." She kept her voice flat because this was not the moment for anything else. "I know what the classification markings on his uniform mean. I know what Nightfall is, and I know that the medication he was given in the field is interacting with something he was given here in the last 2 hours." Ose looked at the chart in her hand, back at the monitor. "What do you mean something he was given here?" "I need to look at his full medication history from intake." She looked at Ose directly. "The last 2 hours specifically." "She is not authorized to review any patient record," Vey said from across the room. "Then you look at it," Emily said. "Look at what was ordered after intake and tell me if it's consistent with his presentation." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds, which felt much longer. Ose turned to the resident. "Pull the intake record. Full medication log from arrival." Vey took a step forward. "Patricia, I'm the attending on this case, Malcolm." Ose's voice was quiet and completely steady. "You can file whatever objection you want after we stabilize him." Emily watched Vey's face. She'd expected anger. She'd already seen his anger that morning, knew how it moved across his features. What she saw instead was something closer to calculation. He was figuring out his next move. People who are genuinely certain they're right don't do that. They argue. They insist. They go loud. Malcolm Vey went quiet and stood near the door, and that was more frightening than anything he'd said all morning. The medication log arrived on a tablet, and Ose scanned it while Emily looked over her shoulder with enough professional restraint that nobody technically had grounds to object. The resident, young, tired-looking, holding the tablet with both hands, was watching Emily watch the screen. She found it on the third scroll. A medication had been added to the IV protocol at 7:52 a.m., not unusual in itself. What was unusual was that it had been ordered outside the standard triage protocol, flagged as a supplemental order, and the ordering physician's ID had been recorded incorrectly. One digit transposed in a way that might look like a clerical error and might not be. Emily knew the medication. She had seen it used before. It was a sedative adjunct that had legitimate applications in certain high-intensity trauma cases, but in a patient with specific neurological markers, the kind of markers she was looking at right now on this monitor, it didn't suppress pain. It suppressed voluntary cognitive response. It essentially put a floor on consciousness. Not enough to kill, necessarily, but enough to keep someone from communicating. She said it out loud because the alternative was keeping it in her head, and she was done being quiet. This medication shouldn't be in his protocol. She pointed at the entry without touching the screen. Not with his presentation. It's not contraindicated in general, but with the neurological pattern he's showing, it's specifically counterindicated. And the order time is 40 minutes after we got confirmation that he was showing voluntary responses. Ose had gone very still. "Who entered this order?" she said to the resident. "The physician ID." "I know the physician ID is wrong," Ose said. "Who physically entered it?" Nobody answered that immediately, which was its own kind of answer. Emily looked toward the door. Vey had moved during the conversation. She'd tracked it peripherally, and was now standing closer to the exit than to the gurney. He was holding his phone with the screen facing inward. "Dr. Vey," Osei said, "can you tell me when you first accessed this patient's file?" "I wasn't involved in this case." "The system will have a log." "Then you can review the log." His voice was controlled, almost bored. "I have surgical cases to prepare for. This patient is outside my department." He looked at Emily one last time, and the thing in his eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was something simpler and colder. "Whatever she's telling you, I'd think carefully about how much weight you're putting on the word of a suspended employee who has no business being in this room." He left. The trauma bay felt different once he was gone. Not better, exactly, but more honest somehow. Like a window had been opened in a room where the air had been wrong. Osei set the tablet down. She looked at Emily for a long moment. "Tell me everything you know about this medication and why it's a problem for this specific patient," Emily told her. She spoke in the clean, compressed language of someone who had spent years giving reports in the field. No extra words, no hedging, no performance. Just information in the order it was needed. Osei listened without interrupting, which Emily had learned was a good sign. People who are actually paying attention don't interrupt. When Emily finished, Osei turned to the resident. "Get pharmacy on the line. I want a full reconciliation of this protocol in the last 3 hours." She turned back to Emily. "You said Nightfall was a classified recovery trigger. What does that mean, specifically?" "It means his unit had a protocol for catastrophic trauma that combined neurological stimulation with a specific verbal cue. It was conditioned, behavioral medicine stuff. I wasn't in the room for the training, but I was on 2 deployments where the result is what you saw 10 minutes ago. The word functions as a reset input when the cognitive system has partially shut down." She paused. "It doesn't work on everyone. It only works if you were trained to it, which means whoever that man is, he was attached to a unit that ran that specific program." Osei looked at the monitor. The patient's vitals had stabilized in the last 12 minutes. Not dramatically, but measurably. He was still critical, but the trajectory had shifted. "And the person who would know about that program," Osei said slowly, "would be someone who had also been attached to that unit." Emily said nothing. "Which is not on your personnel record here." "It's on a personnel record," Emily said, "just not the one you'd know to ask for." Outside, through the small window in the trauma bay wall, she could see the ambulance bay. The 2 black SUVs were still there. A third vehicle had joined them while they'd been talking. Larger, government plates, and 2 people in civilian clothing standing beside it who had the posture of people who were paid to stand still and notice everything. More were coming. She didn't know how many. She looked at the monitor again, at the slow, steady, improbable rise of the waveform that hadn't been there an hour ago. Whatever Captain Hale was carrying was whatever it was that someone had tried to make sure he couldn't say, it was still inside him, still intact. She had bought him time, maybe. An hour, a few hours. She didn't know yet if that would be enough. But in the doorway behind her, she heard a sound she recognized from 4 years spent in places where the stakes of a room could shift in seconds. The particular tread of multiple sets of boots moving with purpose through a corridor, heading in her direction. And she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that whatever this was, whatever Malcolm Vey had done, whatever was in that medication log, whatever classified thing this soldier was carrying in his damaged body, it had just become something much larger than a hospital dispute. The door to the trauma bay opened. The man who stepped in first was wearing a uniform. He looked at Emily. He looked at the patient. Then he looked back at Emily with the specific expression of someone who had been briefed and was now recalibrating based on something the briefing hadn't covered. "Which one of you said the word?" he asked. Emily said, "I did." The man in uniform didn't move immediately. He looked at her the way people look at something they weren't expecting to find where they found it. Not hostile, not welcoming, just recalibrating. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had learned a long time ago not to give much away. His name tape read Calloway. The 2 people behind him, one woman, one man, both in civilian clothing, with lanyards flipped backward so the IDs weren't visible, fanned out slightly when they entered the room, positioning themselves without being asked. Nobody had trained them to do that just now. It was older than that. You administered a stimulus response protocol to a classified special operations patient, Calloway said. It wasn't quite a question. I said a word to a man who was dying, Emily said. His response told me he'd been through the program. I don't know what program. I know what the response looks like. How do you know what the response looks like? 2 deployments. I was attached as a combat medic to a unit that ran that conditioning. I never went through the protocol myself. I was support. Calloway looked at Dr. Osei. Who authorized her to be in this room? She identified a contraindicated medication order in his protocol, Osei said. I authorized her presence on clinical grounds. She's suspended, said a voice from the hallway. Emily didn't have to look. She already knew the voice. What she didn't know was how fast he'd come back or why, and both of those things were worth thinking about. Vey stepped into the doorway again. Not fully into the room, which was its own piece of information. He was standing at the threshold like someone who wanted to be heard, but wasn't certain yet whether walking in was the right move. She was suspended this morning for conduct violations. Whatever she told you, she's not authorized to be on this floor, and anything she's touched is a liability issue for this hospital. Calloway turned to look at him with the particular patience of someone who has dealt with interference before and has developed a system for it. And you are? Dr. Malcolm Vey, Chief of Surgical Services. He straightened slightly. This patient was brought to my hospital. I have a right to know who you are and what authorization you have to... You'll receive a briefing within the appropriate chain, Calloway said. Right now, I'd ask you to step back from this doorway. I'm not going to... Dr. Vey. The woman in civilian clothing spoke for the first time. She hadn't moved from her position near the monitor, and she didn't raise her voice. We've pulled the access logs for this patient's file. Someone with a credentialing error in their physician ID entered a supplemental medication order at 7:52 this morning. The pharmacy is currently reviewing it. I'd suggest, for your own clarity, that you step back. The hallway behind Vey was visible over his shoulder. 2 uniformed MPs had positioned themselves there, not threateningly, not with hands on anything. Just there. Present. The specific weight of their presence did its work without any additional communication. Vey looked at Emily. Whatever was in that look, whatever he'd intended it to communicate, it didn't land the way he wanted it to, because she was already looking at the monitor again, tracking the waveform, counting the intervals between the changes in the pattern. She heard him leave. She didn't watch him go. The next 40 minutes had the compressed, airless quality of time moving faster than the room could hold. Calloway made 3 calls that Emily wasn't positioned to hear clearly, though she caught fragments, a name she didn't recognize, a location code that meant nothing to her out of context, and the phrase confirm witness status twice. The civilian woman, who introduced herself only as Ferris, no rank, no title, had taken over the coordination with Osei and was working through the medication log with a pharmacist on speaker who sounded like someone who hadn't slept and had just been told why. Emily stayed near the gurney. Nobody formally told her to stay or to go, and she had learned years ago that in situations like this, a quiet person doing something useful was harder to remove than a person standing still and waiting for permission. She was monitoring his neurological indicators manually, the small things, the finger movement intervals, the eye response to light, cross-referencing them with what she knew about the Nightfall protocol's documented recovery windows. There were things about that program she'd never been officially told, and had pieced together from observation, from the quiet conversations that happened in field stations between people who trusted each other because they'd bled nearby each other. It was imperfect knowledge. It was also, right now, the most relevant knowledge in the room. His intervals are shortening, she said to Osei primarily. The response gaps, he's coming up. Coming up how fast? I don't know. With the suppressive in his system still clearing, maybe another hour before he's verbal, maybe less. Osei made a note. What does verbal look like for someone in this recovery stage? Fragmented, non-sequential. He'll have periods of clarity and then drop back. Don't try to push for a coherent narrative early. He'll get frustrated and it'll spike his pressure. She paused. Let him lead. Ask yes or no questions when you need confirmation. He'll tell you what he needs to tell you if you give him the room to do it on his own terms. Osei was quiet for a moment. You've seen this recovery before. Once, fully. Twice, partially. She moved slightly, adjusting her angle on the monitor. The one I saw fully took 3 hours to get to sustained conversation, but he hadn't had a suppressant on top of it. So we don't know. No, we don't know. Osei said nothing else, which Emily appreciated. There was a kind of honesty in not filling silence with reassurance, and she had spent too many years in rooms where the silence got filled with things that weren't true because the truth was too uncomfortable to stand in. Ferris appeared at her elbow without announcement. I need to ask you some questions. Okay? Not here. She indicated the hallway with a slight movement. 5 minutes. Emily looked at the monitor. At Hale. At the slow, improbable steadying of a line that 2 hours ago had been approaching something final. 3 minutes, she said. Then I'm back in here. Ferris looked at her for a beat. Fine. The hallway outside the trauma bay had been cleared, not conspicuously, but the usual foot traffic was gone, and the nurse's station at the far end was occupied by someone who wasn't a nurse. Emily noticed all of it in the first 5 seconds and filed it away. Ferris stood with her back to the wall, tablet in hand, and looked at Emily with the expression of someone who had decided to be direct because they didn't have time for the alternative. You have a military service record that required a specific security clearance to access, she said. I accessed it 20 minutes ago. It says you were attached to the 4th Medical Battalion as a forward combat medic for 2 deployments, and then you were reassigned to a support role in an unspecified operational capacity for the following 14 months. Emily said nothing. The 14 months are redacted, not summarized, redacted. That's above my pay grade to explain. Whose pay grade is it? I genuinely don't know anymore. The unit I was attached to was restructured after I separated. The people who would know the specifics are in positions I don't have contact with. Ferris made a note. The word you said to Captain Hale. Where did you learn it? A medic I worked with, Sergeant Del Rey Okoye. He'd been through the protocol himself, and he explained the basic mechanics to me during a field rotation because he wanted me to know what to do if something happened to him. And did something happen to him? Emily looked down the hallway. Yes. Ferris didn't push. She made another note and then looked up. Captain Hale is carrying material testimony in a federal investigation into defense procurement fraud. The accident that put him in this hospital was not an accident. We believe it was staged to create a medical emergency that would result in either his death or a period of incapacitation long enough for certain evidence to be moved. Emily absorbed that. How long have you known it wasn't an accident? Long enough that we had people positioned near this hospital, not inside it. We didn't have grounds for that level of presence yet, but near it. And the medication that was added to his protocol this morning. We're working on the documentation trail. The physician ID that was entered incorrectly. The transposition was specific, 1 digit, in a way that when corrected points to a ghost credential that exists in the hospital system but doesn't correspond to any current staff member. That kind of thing doesn't happen accidentally. It takes someone with administrative access and enough familiarity with the system to know where the audit controls have gaps. Emily felt something settle into place that she hadn't fully articulated before. The particular sensation of a picture becoming recognizable. He had access to the administrative system. Ferris looked at her steadily. Most department chiefs do. What was the medication supposed to do? Best case scenario for whoever ordered it? Keep him unresponsive long enough that the clinical window for certain types of verbal testimony passed. If he coded again, and his condition earlier suggested he was close, the medication would have made resuscitation significantly harder to achieve. The outcome would have been documented as a complication of his initial trauma. Emily stood with that for a moment. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang twice and stopped. He would have died, she said. Not a question. Very likely. Ferris closed the tablet cover. Which makes what you did in that room 45 minutes ago a material intervention in an active federal case. She paused. You should know that. I know that. It also means that your presence in this building from this point forward is not informal. We would like you to remain with Captain Hale's care team in an advisory capacity until he achieves stable verbal function. Your knowledge of the protocol is the only thing we have that can reliably interpret his recovery stage. Emily looked at her. My suspension is being reviewed. Ferris's voice was flat, in the way that suggested the review had a predetermined outcome, and they both understood it. That's the official language. The practical reality is that you're not going anywhere unless you want to. She didn't want to. She already knew that. She'd known it since she heard the radio crackle in the canteen and moved toward the doors. 3 minutes are up, Emily said, and went back inside. Hale's first voluntary sound came at the 50-minute mark. Not a word. Not yet. But a controlled exhale that was different from the unconscious respiratory rhythm of the preceding hour. Emily was the one who noticed it, and she said nothing out loud, just adjusted her position and waited. The room had settled into a different kind of tension. Calloway was still present, stationed near the window with his arms at his sides, watching with the patience of someone who had spent long periods of time watching things he couldn't accelerate. Osei was managing the clinical monitoring with her resident, who had not left since the initial assessment, and who had the hollow-eyed intensity of someone running on adrenaline and the dawning recognition that this was not a normal shift. The nurses who had been there at the beginning had been rotated out, not by anyone's direct order, but by the natural reconfiguration of the room as it became clear that fewer people with clear roles was better. The nurse who remained was a man named Terrence, who was experienced and quiet, and who had caught on faster than most to the fact that fewer questions was the appropriate posture for this particular hour. At the 58-minute mark, Hale's eyes opened. Not fully. Not with the immediate clarity that people expected from the movies, where someone wakes from a coma and their eyes are clear and they know exactly where they are. His eyes opened to a partial position and then moved. Tracked the ceiling, tracked the light, tracked the IV line up to the bag, and back down to the point of entry on his arm. The tracking itself was what mattered. It was purposeful. It was not random. Emily leaned into his field of vision without getting too close. Captain. His eyes found her. You're at a hospital. You're in a trauma bay. You've been here for about 2 hours. She kept her voice even. No urgency. No performance. Do you understand where you are? A very small nod. More of a tension and release than an actual head movement, but a nod. Can you tell me your name? His mouth moved. Nothing came out. He tried again. Hale! The word was barely sound, more like the shape of a word than the sound of one. Okay, Captain Hale, I'm Emily. I'm a nurse and I was a combat medic. You're going to feel like you're moving through something heavy for a while. That's normal. Don't fight it. His eyes stayed on her. There was something in them that was not confusion, something that had been waiting. Nightfall, he said, or tried to say. The word was fractured across 2 breaths, but she caught it. Yes, she said. That's what I said to you. Something shifted in his face, recognition maybe, or relief, or both, which were sometimes the same thing in people who had been waiting to be found. Calloway had moved without Emily noticing, and he was now standing at the foot of the gurney. Captain Hale, I'm Calloway. You know who I work for? Hale's eyes moved to him. A longer blink. Affirmative. Don't try for the full briefing right now. Give us what's urgent. Hale's hand moved. The same pattern as before, the one Emily had first seen as deliberate. He was counting something, or indicating something. His mouth worked again. The files, he said. 2 syllables, each one costing something. Transferred. Before, he stopped. His breathing changed, not dangerously, but with effort. Before the accident. The files were transferred before the accident? Calloway said. A slow blink. Yes. To where? Hale's eyes closed. Not unconscious, the monitors didn't shift. Just the effort of a man in pain trying to organize language when language felt like trying to move furniture through water. When his eyes opened again, he looked at Emily first, not Calloway. Vey, he said. The room didn't make a sound. Vey received the files? Calloway said. But Hale was looking at Emily and his hand had moved again. Not the count pattern. Something different. 2 fingers extended. Then 1. She watched it twice before she understood it. He wasn't saying Vey received the files. He was saying Vey was one of 2 people on a list. "There's someone else," she said. To Calloway, because he needed to hear it, and to Hale, because he needed to know she'd understood. "He's telling you there's a second person." Calloway looked at her, then back at Hale. "Captain, is there a second individual involved in the transfer?" The blink was slower this time, but it came. "Okay," Calloway said quietly. He stepped back and pulled out his phone and began typing with the focused economy of someone who had already decided what the next 12 hours were going to look like. Hale's eyes were still on Emily. She held his gaze and didn't say anything reassuring because she didn't think he needed reassurance. She thought he needed someone to keep watching so he knew the room was holding. "You're doing fine," she said finally, because it was true, and because even soldiers who didn't need reassurance sometimes needed the truth. His hand moved once more. Not a signal she recognized, just his fingers pressing briefly against the gurney surface. A small, private gesture that might have meant anything or nothing at all. She let it be what it was. The next disruption came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated, which meant she should have anticipated it. Administrator Gail Pruitt arrived at the Trauma Bay entrance at 10:40 a.m. with the hospital's general counsel, a man named Bosworth, who wore his anxiety in his shoulders and had the look of someone who had received a phone call that had gone 3 standard deviations outside his normal professional experience. Pruitt was not anxious. Pruitt was something more controlled and therefore more difficult to read. She had the practiced composure of a hospital administrator who had navigated liability situations before and understood that the goal was not to feel less threatened, but to look less threatening. She looked at Emily first. Emily had expected that. "Ms. Hart is suspended," she said. Her voice was the professional version of the same thing Vey had said, which was a different thing than the same thing. More careful, more documented, more structured around what would hold up in writing. Her presence in a clinical setting while suspended creates exposure for this institution. Her presence in this clinical setting preserved the life of a patient who is a material witness in a federal investigation, Ferris said from across the room. She hadn't announced herself. She just responded. "We can discuss exposure in a room that isn't this one." Pruitt looked at Ferris with the particular expression of someone recalibrating who has authority over what. "I need to understand the legal basis for a federal presence in my hospital without a court order." "You have my credentials." Ferris indicated the lanyard she was now holding visible. "And you'll have documentation within the hour. In the meantime, the patient's care is my operational priority, and Ms. Hart is part of the clinical advisory team for this case." Bosworth had been writing something on a notepad in small, controlled letters. He looked up. "That designation, advisory team, is that a formal—" "It's formal as of this conversation," Ferris said. "Yes." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. She looked at the room, at Hale on the gurney, at Osei near the monitor, at Calloway near the window, at the 2 MPs still positioned in the hallway behind her. She was doing the calculation that administrators do when they realize the situation has expanded past the boundaries of the problem they came in to solve. "I'll need everything documented," she said finally. "All of it." "It will be," Ferris said. Pruitt looked at Emily one more time. Emily didn't look away. She'd spent the morning being looked at like a problem. This was a different look. Not warm, not apologetic, but uncertain. Like a door that had been firmly closed was now slightly ajar, and Pruitt wasn't sure yet if she wanted to open it further or pretend the gap wasn't there. Pruitt and Bosworth left. Emily exhaled slowly through her nose and turned back to the monitor. The afternoon fractured into pieces she could only hold in sequence afterward, not as a continuous whole. At 12:15, pharmacy completed the drug reconciliation and confirmed that the medication entered at 7:52 a.m. was inconsistent with the attending physician's documented treatment plan and had been added by a credential that did not match any staff member who had physically accessed the floor during that window. The report went to Ferris. Ferris did not share the full contents with the room, but she made 2 calls in rapid succession, and her voice had a different quality in those calls than it had before. More compressed, like someone who has confirmed something they already knew and is now moving to the next stage. At 1:30, a second federal vehicle arrived in the ambulance bay. Emily saw it through the window, larger than the others, different plates. At 2:10, Hale spoke in a longer sequence for the first time. He was clearer now. The suppressant had been metabolized enough that the ceiling on his cognitive function was lifting. He spoke slowly, with gaps, and sometimes he started a sentence and then stopped and started again from a different point. But he was speaking, and the shape of what he was saying was beginning to cohere into something with geography and names, and a structure that meant it could be verified. Emily stayed near the head of the gurney and tracked his vital signs while he talked. It was her cover for remaining present. The clinical justification, the thing that kept her in the room when other people might have asked her to step out. Calloway had stopped being uncertain about her presence. He addressed questions to her directly now, using her by name, which was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. She heard Vay's name twice in Hale's account. She heard a number, a dollar figure, eight digits, that Calloway wrote down without reacting to and then photographed with his phone. She heard the name of a defense contractor that she didn't recognize and wouldn't have recognized even if she had, because it was the kind of name chosen specifically to be forgettable. She heard a timeline, and the timeline was longer than she'd expected, and that changed the shape of what she was looking at from a crisis to something more deliberate, more constructed. What she didn't hear was the second name. Hale gave the dollar figure, gave the contractor, gave the dates. When Calloway asked him about the second individual, using phrasing that made clear he understood there were two, Hale went quiet in a way that Emily recognized as not the quiet of someone who didn't know, but the quiet of someone deciding how much to trust the room they were in. "Captain," she said, "you indicated there were two people, with the file transfer." His eyes moved to her, stayed. "If that second person is still in this building," she said quietly, "that matters to the people trying to help you right now." A long pause. His hand was still on the gurney surface. His fingers moved. Not the signal pattern, just movement. The small motor restlessness of a man working something through. "Radner," he said. Calloway had his phone out before the second syllable. "Spell it." Hale spelled it. Calloway was already walking toward the door, typing as he moved, and the woman who had come in with the second vehicle was already meeting him in the hallway, and they were talking in the low, rapid register of people who were standing somewhere and thinking about somewhere else. Emily looked at Hale. He had closed his eyes again, not unconscious, just the rest of a person who had spent significant energy on a significant thing. His breathing was even. His color was better than it had been 2 hours ago, measurably better, which meant the cleared medication and Osei's adjusted protocol were doing what they were supposed to do. "You did well," she said. No response, but the corner of his mouth moved, very slightly. It wasn't exactly a smile. It was something more exhausted than a smile, and possibly more genuine because of it. She turned to check the monitor, and that's when Terrence caught her attention from across the room. A small gesture, just a head movement, toward the hallway. She stepped out. Terrence was a careful man. He didn't gesture for nothing. She had learned that in the 3 years they'd worked the same floor, which was a different kind of knowledge than the military knowledge or the clinical knowledge, but not a lesser kind. He was standing just outside the bay door, and his expression had the quality of someone who had seen something and wasn't certain what to do with it. "About 20 minutes ago," he said, keeping his voice low, "while Ferris was on the phone and you were with the captain, Dr. Vay came back to the floor." Emily went still. "He came back." "He didn't come in here. He went to the nurses' station. He asked Renata for a patient transfer form. Said it was for a different case, surgical prep. But he was looking down the hall the whole time." Terrence paused. "And he had his phone out when he walked away. He was typing something." "Did you see what?" "No. But Renata said the form he asked for. She looked it up after he left. It's not for any patient currently on his surgical schedule." Emily thought about that. About a man who had been asked to step back and had done so, and had returned when the room was occupied and had asked for a document that had no obvious current use. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He went toward the elevators." She looked down the hallway. At the nurses' station. At the elevator bank at the far end, doors closed, nothing moving. She looked at the second federal vehicle through the window. At Calloway's profile, visible through the glass of the bay door, still on his phone, still typing. There were things she knew and things she didn't know. And in the space between them was a man who had already tried once and had been interrupted and who now knew, had to know, that the situation had changed in ways that made his original plan untenable. That kind of person didn't just leave. She turned back to Terrence. "Find Ferris, right now. Tell her what you told me." "Should I tell Calloway?" "Tell Ferris first. She'll know who else." She was already moving back toward the bay. "Don't go looking for Vay yourself." She stepped back inside and positioned herself where she could see both the monitor and the door, and she thought about second names and transfer forms, and the particular desperation of a man who understood that the window was closing and hadn't yet decided whether to run or to do something worse. Hale's vitals were steady. The room was quiet. But somewhere in this building, Malcolm Vay was typing something on his phone, and the form he'd asked for was sitting on a counter with no surgical patient attached to it, and the elevator at the end of the hallway had just opened. Emily watched the bay door and didn't move. The elevator opened and nobody came out. Emily watched the bay door for 11 seconds before she let herself look away, and in those 11 seconds she ran through the calculations that her body had learned to run before her mind caught up. Threat assessment, position, exits, assets in the room. Old habits didn't die. They just waited for the conditions that made them useful again. Terrence had gone. She trusted that he'd find Ferris. She trusted it because in 3 years she had never seen Terrence fail to do a thing he said he would do. And that was a small data set, but it was a clean one. Osei was at the monitor. Hale was resting, not unconscious. What? She could tell from the regularity of his breathing, the slight tension in his forearms that sleeping patients didn't carry. He was listening to the room even with his eyes closed. Combat habit. She recognized it because she had it too. She moved to Osei's side. "I need to talk to you about something that's not on the monitor." Osei looked at her. "Now?" A few minutes ago, Vay came back to the floor and asked for a patient transfer form that doesn't correspond to any current surgical case. Osei set down the stylus she'd been using. The movement was slow and deliberate in the way of someone who is being careful not to react visibly in a room where several people are watching. "That could be administrative prep," she said. "Surgeons sometimes pull forms early." He was looking down this hallway while he asked for it, and he was typing on his phone when he left. Osei was quiet. "You think he's trying to move the patient?" "I think he's running out of options, and I think that makes him more dangerous than he was this morning, not less. This morning he had a plan. Right now I'm not sure what he has." "Ferris knows?" "Terrence is telling her now." Osei nodded once. She turned back to the monitor and made a small adjustment to the display settings. Not because anything needed adjusting, Emily could see that clearly, but because Osei needed something to do with her hands while she thought. "His pressure's been stable for 40 minutes, Osei said. "We're in a window where transport would be medically inadvisable, but not impossible. If someone with institutional authority pushed for a transfer on paper, I could fight it clinically, but it would take time." "That's the window," Emily said. "That's what he's looking at." They both understood it without saying it plainly. A patient transferred to another facility was a patient outside the radius of Calloway and Ferris and everything that had been building in this room for the last 4 hours. A patient who crashed in transit was a tragedy with a paper trail that pointed nowhere useful. Hale's eyes opened. He hadn't moved. His head was still angled the same direction, his hands still resting where they'd been. But his eyes were open and they were clear in a way they hadn't been even 20 minutes ago. The sedative metabolizing faster now, or the man's constitution burning through it on stubbornness alone. "Transfer," he said. Emily looked at him. "You heard that. Don't." The word was low and direct, not frightened, instructive. "Don't let them move me." "We won't," she said. And then, because she wasn't certain she could deliver that alone, "Ferris won't." "Radner," he said. "Radner has rank. Enough rank to—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. The effort was visible in a way it hadn't been earlier, which meant either the conversation with Calloway had cost him more than it seemed, or something was shifting in his neurological recovery in a direction she didn't love. "Radner can authorize a transfer through channels Calloway doesn't control." "Who is Radner?" Osei asked. "Hospital board," Emily said. Not because she knew, she was inferring from the geography of what Hale had said earlier and what Terrence had described, and the way the access logs had lined up around a credential with administrative clearance. or something close to it, someone with a structural position in this hospital, not just a clinical one. Hale blinked once. Confirmation. Is Radner in this building right now? She asked him. A pause. Then, I don't know. She believed him. She turned toward the door, and at that exact moment, Ferris came through it with Terrence 2 steps behind her and the expression of someone who had just received information that compressed the timeline by a significant margin. We have a problem, Ferris said. Radner, Emily said. Ferris stopped. You know about Radner. Hale just told us. Who is he? Deputy Director of Operations for the hospital's parent health system. He sits on the governance board. He has transfer authorization that bypasses the attending physician approval process under a regulatory waiver that the system got granted 3 years ago. She was already talking while she moved to the monitor, to Hale, assessing him with the rapid visual sweep of someone who had field medical training underneath the federal investigator exterior. He used that waiver twice before in patient management disputes. Both times the patients involved were connected to cases that subsequently went cold. The room heard that. Osei's head came up. Terrence, who had been quiet near the door, had gone very still. Where is he now? Calloway asked from behind Ferris. He had come in without Emily noticing, which told her the hallway had been reorganized again while she wasn't watching it. His access card put him in the building 40 minutes ago. After that, the system has him on 2 floors simultaneously, which means he's spoofed his badge. Ferris pulled out her phone. We're working on physical location. He could already have the paperwork in motion, Emily said. He could, Ferris agreed. She did not say it with the tone of someone who found that acceptable. She said it with the tone of someone who had already planned for it, which is why Captain Hale's attending physician is going to issue a medical hold order in the next 4 minutes, and why that order is going to be documented through 3 separate channels simultaneously. Osei was already typing. I need the specific language. I'll send it to you directly. Ferris was typing while talking. It needs to cite hemodynamic instability, an active neurological monitoring protocol. Both of those are clinically accurate? Both accurate, Emily confirmed, watching the monitor. His pressure has been stable, but the waveform has been irregular in the last 20 minutes. I'd want another hour of observation minimum before I'd consider transport safe, regardless of any other factors. Then that's what the hold says. Ferris sent something from her phone. Osei's tablet pinged 3 seconds later. Hale had been watching all of this. His head hadn't moved, but his eyes tracked the room in a way that Emily recognized as someone performing their own tactical assessment from a prone position with limited mobility. He was counting people, counting exits, making the evaluations that didn't stop just because you were the one on the gurney. The second location, he said. His voice was stronger than it had been an hour ago, which was either good news or the kind of thing that looked like good news and was actually his system pushing harder than it should. The files, physical copies, not just digital. Calloway moved closer. You said the transfer happened before the accident. Digital transfer. But Vey kept physical documentation, parallel record, in case he needed leverage. Hale paused. One careful breath. I saw it twice, as in his office. You've been in Vey's office? Calloway said. Once to deliver. Once? He stopped. Once because I went back when I realized what I was delivering. That landed in the room and settled. You have a witness statement about the physical location of documentation connecting Vey to the fraud, Calloway said. Not a question. Confirming for the record, for whatever recording she had to assume was already running somewhere. Yes, Hale said, simply. Like the word cost nothing, which meant it had probably cost something. Calloway looked at Ferris. She was already on the phone. Bump. The medical hold was filed and countersigned at 2:47 p.m. It went through the hospital's electronic system and simultaneously to the federal case file and to a fax number Emily didn't ask about. Osei signed it with the particular calm of a physician who has made a decision and closed the door behind her, and Emily respected that more than she would have been able to articulate. For 11 minutes, nothing happened. Emily stood near the monitor and tracked the intervals in Hale's neurological indicators and tried to think about the shape of what she didn't know yet. There was a man in this building who had helped build a scheme that had put soldiers in danger and was now watching the walls close in. There was physical documentation in an office on a floor above her head. There were two federal investigators making calls in a hallway and a military officer coordinating something she had partial visibility into and partial blindness to. She had been a combat medic. She had been trained to work in conditions where she had incomplete information and had to act on what she had in front of her. She understood that the fog of a situation wasn't a flaw in the situation. It was the situation. You worked with what you could see and you stayed alert to what you couldn't. What she could see right now was that Hale's left hand had developed a tremor in the last 6 minutes. Fine motor. Not severe. The kind of thing that might not show on the monitor because it was below the threshold of what the sensors were calibrated to flag. She watched it for another 30 seconds to confirm it was an artifact, patient movement, equipment contact, and then she moved to Osei's side. Left hand, she said quietly. Fine motor tremor. Started about 6 minutes ago. Osei looked. Rate? Maybe 8 per minute. Irregular. Osei moved to Hale's side and conducted the assessment efficiently. Visual, tactile, a light percussion test at the wrist. Emily watched her face. Osei had a face that was good at not showing things, but the thing about people whose faces are good at not showing things is that the absence of expression becomes its own expression when something warrants it. Captain, Osei said, I'm going to ask you to squeeze my hand. He did. She noted the grip, asked him to release and repeat. Her mouth was a straight line by the second repetition. She stepped back and spoke to Emily at a volume that kept it between them. There's a deficit. Left side is weaker than right by a significant margin. Given the timeline and the current medications, I want a repeat neuroassessment, and I want it now. This could be a recovery artifact from the suppressant clearing unevenly, or it could be something structural we haven't fully imaged. What's the worst case? There was blunt trauma to the left temporal region on intake. We've been managing the visible injury. If there's delayed swelling that wasn't fully evident on the initial CT, he could have a bleed developing. I want to repeat CT before I say that. How long? 40 minutes to get him through imaging and back. In the current, she gestured, not at anything specific, at everything. In the current environment, 40 minutes is a long time. Emily looked at Hale. He was watching them both. He had heard enough to understand the shape of it, even if not all the clinical specifics, and his expression had the particular quality of someone who has just been handed a new problem on top of all the existing problems and has made the internal decision not to react to it yet. Do we need to move him? He asked. For the imaging, yes, Osei said. Briefly, through the hospital. That's what Radner needs, he said. A window. It's also what you need medically, she said. I don't move you, and something is developing intracranially. We lose the window where treatment is straightforward. He was quiet for a moment. How long can we wait before the window closes? I don't know. That's the problem. Osei's voice was steady. The tremor might plateau and not progress. Or it might be the leading edge of something that moves fast. In my experience, when you're asking how long you can wait, you've usually already waited too long. Hale looked at Emily. It wasn't the look of a man asking for permission. It was the look of a man taking a reading from someone he'd decided to trust. She's right, Emily said, and we'll make sure the route is covered. He exhaled. Fine. Do it. Osei was already on the phone to radiology when the door opened and Calloway came back in with a speed that was just short of running. Vay's not on the floor, he said, and the office where Hale says the physical files are located. Someone just requested access using Vay's badge. But Vay's badge has been in the possession of hospital security since 11 this morning. The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Someone cloned his credential, Ferris said from the doorway. Or someone who has Vay's codes from the inside. Calloway looked at Hale. Radner. He'd have the access, Hale said. He restructured the building's credential system 18 months ago. He'd know how to replicate a physician's badge access. How close is your team to a physical location on him? Emily asked Ferris. We're tracking the badge access. If he's in that office, he's not going there to read the files, Emily said. He's going there to get them out or destroy them. That's why he spoofed Vay's credential. So the access log looks like Vay went to his own office. But nobody in the room said anything for about 2 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for the logic to complete itself. How far is that office from here? Calloway asked. 4th floor, Osei said. North wing. Calloway was already at the door. I need 2 people upstairs now. Your badge shows you going through the stairwell on the south side, Ferris said, already moving with him. North stairs will be faster. The MPs can go ahead. They left. The room was quieter with 4 fewer people in it. Emily stood at the monitor and looked at the tremor in Hale's left hand, which had not stopped, and at the clock on the wall above the door, which read 3:04 p.m. "Oh, say," she said, "how soon can we have transport ready for the CT? Radiology is prepping now. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She looked at Hale. He had closed his eyes again. Not rest this time, she thought. The kind of eyes closed that was preparation. The internal gathering of resources before the next thing. You should know, she said to him, that whatever happens in the next hour, you gave them what they needed, the name, the location of the files. He didn't open his eyes. They have to actually get there first. They will. He said nothing. The monitor was steady. The tremor continued its small, irregular motion. Somewhere above her head, on the 4th floor north wing, a door was either being opened or had already been opened by a man who understood that the window was nearly closed and had decided to move through it anyway. And then the monitor changed. Not catastrophically, not the flatline drop of cardiac arrest or the jagged spike of a seizure. Something subtler and in some ways worse, a gradual pattern shift in the intracranial pressure indicator, the kind of change that built rather than spiked, the kind that didn't set off the automated alarm because it was still within the outer edge of the acceptable range. Emily saw it. Osei was already at the bedside before Emily finished saying her name. "That's progression," Osei said, looking at the display. Her voice was flat in the specific way of a physician who has moved past reaction and into procedure. "We need to move him now. Right now. Transport team ready? I'm calling them up." She was on the phone before the sentence ended. Hale had opened his eyes. He felt it, not the specific numbers, but the change in the room, the shift from watchful to urgent. His right hand moved to the side rail of the gurney and gripped it. "Tell me straight," he said. "There may be pressure building in your skull from the original injury," Osei said. "We need imaging now to know how much and where. If we catch it early, treatment is straightforward. If we wait, then we don't wait," he said. The transport team came through the door at 3:09 p.m. 2 orderlies and a nurse Emily didn't recognize from another floor, which meant Osei had called it wide and fast. They began repositioning equipment and unlocking the gurney wheels with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times, and Emily moved with them, maintaining her position at the head of the gurney because she was not going to lose visual contact with his neurological indicators over a 40-minute imaging window. They were halfway through the bay door when Emily's phone buzzed, a number she didn't have saved. She answered it because the day had reached the point where unknown numbers warranted answering. Calloway's voice. "We're in Vay's office, 4th floor north." "And?" A pause. The kind of pause that had information in it. "He was here," Calloway said. "Radner. We found the file drawer forced open. There are some materials still here. He didn't get everything. But Emily," the gurney was moving into the hallway. She matched its pace without looking away from Hale. "Vay is here too," Calloway said. "He's not alone." She stopped walking. The orderlies kept moving. She held up a hand and they slowed, turned, looked at her with the mild confusion of people who have been given a clear direction and then had it interrupted. "Calloway?" she said. "What do you mean he's not alone?" The line was quiet for 2 full seconds. Not dead. She could hear background sounds, voices, the specific acoustics of a room she'd never been in. "Vay has a patient," Calloway said. "A woman. Staff member. One of the nurses from the surgical floor. He has her in the office, and he has a surgical blade." The hallway was 15 feet wide and suddenly felt much smaller. "Is she injured?" "Not yet." His voice was controlled in the way that military voices get controlled when the situation has exceeded the plan. "He's asking for a vehicle. He says if we move on the office, he'll—" The line stayed open. She heard something in the background. A voice she recognized even through a phone speaker and 40 feet of building because she had heard that voice that morning and had spent the subsequent hours learning its frequencies. Vay. Saying her name. Not Calloway's name, not Ferris's name. Her name. He's asking for you, Calloway said. Emily stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear and made the calculation in about 4 seconds. Vay had asked for her specifically. Not for Calloway, who had rank and authority. Not for Ferris, who had federal credentials and the ability to negotiate on behalf of people with real leverage. He'd asked for Emily Hart, the suspended nurse, the woman he'd humiliated in a patient bay at 6 in the morning, the person he had spent the entire day trying to have removed from the building. That told her something. It told her that he was not thinking clearly, or that he was thinking clearly about the wrong things. People in genuine crisis don't reach for the person they underestimated. They reach for the person they're afraid of. Which meant that on some level, Malcolm Vay had spent the last 8 hours being afraid of her, and had only just admitted it to himself. She handed the phone to Terrence. Tell Calloway I'm coming up. Tell him not to move on the office until I'm there. Tell him 2 minutes. Terrence looked at her. Emily, I'm not going to do anything stupid. I'm going to go up there and look at the situation. She was already moving. Stay with Hale. Don't let that gurney go to imaging without you on it. She took the stairs because the elevator was slow and because she needed the 30 seconds of stairwell to organize her thinking. The north stairwell smelled like industrial cleaning solution and the particular recycled air of a building that moved thousands of people through it every day. She climbed without rushing. Her heart rate was elevated but not spiked, the controlled elevation of a body that knew how to be in a stressful situation without being consumed by it. She had learned that in the field, and she had never fully unlearned it, even after the paperwork that separated her from service and 3 years of hospital corridors and bad coffee in a canteen. The 4th floor was different from the lower floors. Surgical administration wing, quieter, more carpeted, the sounds of the hospital muffled by distance and design. When Emily came through the stairwell door, she found 2 MPs in the corridor holding position outside a closed office door about 30 feet ahead. Calloway was to the left of the door, back to the wall, and he looked at her when she appeared with the expression of someone who has accepted a decision he doesn't fully endorse. He said your name twice, Calloway said. Once to us, once loud enough that we think he was talking through the door for your benefit. He knew I'd be in the building. He's been watching you all day, before we got here, before Ferris, before all of it. You were the problem he was trying to manage. Calloway paused. He doesn't see us as the primary threat. He sees you. I know. She looked at the door. Solid wood, institutional, the kind that hospitals installed in administrative wings because they absorbed sound and gave executives the illusion of privacy. Has he communicated anything beyond asking for me? He wants a vehicle to the parking structure and a 5-minute window. He says he'll release the nurse, her name is Dara. She's a scrub tech from his surgical team. She was apparently doing post-op documentation in his office when he came in. He says he'll release her at the parking structure if his conditions are met. And Radner? Not in the office. He was here and he left before we arrived. We have people at every exit, but Calloway's expression indicated that the butt contained significant information he didn't need to elaborate on. He got out. We're not certain. What files are still in the office? Partial records. Looks like procurement documentation. Vay's copies of contracts with altered specifications. Radner took some before we arrived, but not everything. Either he was interrupted or there was more than he expected. Emily looked at the door again. What's the nurse's status? Do you have eyes? She spoke twice, about 4 minutes ago. Said she wasn't hurt. Voice was controlled. She's scared, but not in shock. He paused. Vay told her to sit down and stay quiet, and she's been doing that. What's he said directly? His exact words. I want to talk to the nurse, Emily Hart. Bring her up here or this gets worse. And then, about a minute later, she'll understand. She's the only one who will. Calloway looked at her steadily. That second part is what concerns me. It concerned Emily too, but for a different reason than it probably concerned Calloway. She's the only one who will. That was not a man asking for a negotiator. That was a man who wanted to be understood, which was more complicated and more dangerous than a man who wanted to escape. People who want to escape are manageable. People who want to be witnessed do unpredictable things when they feel like the witnessing isn't happening the way they imagined. I want to talk to him, she said. Emily, not going in. Not yet. Through the door. She moved to the side of the door frame opposite Calloway and positioned herself so her voice would carry clearly through the wood without requiring her to stand directly in the threshold. Vey. Silence. It's Emily Hart. I'm outside. A pause of about 5 seconds. Then, muffled through the door, come in. Not yet. I want to know Dara is okay first. Another pause. Then a different voice, younger, tighter, female. I'm okay. A breath. I'm sitting down. I'm okay. Thank you, Dara, Emily said. She kept her voice level. Not warm exactly. Performed warmth would register as false, and Vey was, whatever else he was, not unintelligent, just level. Vey, I'm going to tell you what I see from out here, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Nothing for a moment. Then, go ahead. You came to this office to get the files before the investigators reached them. You found that Radner had already been here and taken some of what you needed. You have partial records and you have a witness you didn't plan for. She paused. You asked for me because you think I'll listen in a way the federal agents won't. And maybe you think that because this morning I pushed back on you in front of your staff and that felt like I was taking you seriously, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. The silence from behind the door had a different quality now. Not the silence of someone refusing to engage. The silence of someone listening. You're not wrong, he said finally. His voice was different from this morning. The authority was gone from it, which left something underneath that was raw and more human, and frankly more frightening, because authority at least had structure, and structure was manageable. About most of it. Okay. She looked at Calloway. He was watching her with the focused stillness of someone standing down, letting the play develop. She was grateful for it. Tell me the part I'm wrong about. I didn't plan any of this. His voice came through the door slightly fractured, like he was standing somewhere in the room that wasn't directly behind it. Not the way you think. It started as a consulting arrangement, legitimate, procurement review for a defense contractor. I had expertise in medical equipment specifications. They needed someone who understood hospital acquisition systems. It was paid work, declared. When did it stop being declared? A long pause. When they asked me to sign off on specifications I knew were wrong, he said. Equipment that wouldn't perform to standard in field conditions. I said no the first time. They came back with a different number and He stopped. I had reasons. I'm not going to claim I didn't have reasons. Everyone has reasons, she said. Not forgivingly, just as a fact. I told myself it was one contract, that it was minor, that the specification variance was within a range that probably wouldn't matter in real conditions. His voice shifted slightly, shifted back. And then someone died. A medic. In the field. Using equipment that failed because the specifications had been changed. And I knew. I knew because I had signed off on those specifications, and I knew what they meant. Emily was quiet. Behind her, she could feel Calloway's stillness, the MP's stillness, the particular weight of a hallway full of people not moving. That's when Radner came in, Vey said. He wasn't a solution. He was leverage. He told me what he knew about what I'd signed, and he told me what would happen if it came out. And by that point, I had been doing enough to be afraid of what came out. His voice dropped. He didn't recruit me. He trapped me. And then he used the trap. And Hale, Emily said. Hale was investigating the contractor. He came to me directly. I don't know how he connected me. I never fully knew. He had documentation I hadn't seen. He laid it on my desk, and he told me he was going to a federal oversight committee in 72 hours, and he wanted to give me the opportunity to cooperate first. He exhaled through the door. I told Radner I shouldn't have. I didn't know then what Radner was capable of, or I told myself I didn't know. Which is not the same thing. The accident, she said. The one that put Hale in this hospital. I didn't plan it. Radner did. I found out after it happened, when Radner called me and told me what was coming in, and told me what I was going to put in his protocol. The medication. Yes. Emily pressed her back against the wall beside the door frame and looked down the corridor at nothing in particular. You knew what it would do to him, given his presentation. I'm a surgeon. I know pharmacology. His voice was flat. Yes. I knew. And you did it anyway. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I did it anyway," he said. "And then your word brought him back, and I understood that I had done something that I could not, that there was no version of what I had done that was anything other than what it was." Another pause. I'm not looking for anything from you. I just needed someone in this building to hear me say that who wasn't." He seemed to lose the end of the sentence. "Someone who wasn't a federal agent," she said. "Someone who wasn't performing," he said. "Everyone out there is performing. You're the only one who's been just present all day." It was, she thought, possibly the strangest compliment she had ever received, under circumstances that made it very hard to receive as a compliment at all. "Faye," she said, "you need to open that door and let Dara out. And then you need to come out. The files that are still in that office are going to be recovered. You know that. And what you just told me, the part about Radner trapping you, the part about not knowing what he'd planned for Hale, that matters. Not to me. To the people who are going to determine what happens to you. But only if you come out. And if I don't, then a very frightened young woman stays in that room longer than she needs to, and you make every other thing you just said impossible to use." A very long pause. Longer than any that had come before it. Then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened and Dara came out first. 20-something. Scrubs. Dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with the last 40 minutes and everything to do with being a hospital employee in her second year who had walked into the wrong office at the wrong time. One of the MPs guided her away from the door immediately, a hand on her shoulder, speaking quietly. She was shaking, but she was walking, and she was looking at the floor with the focused attention of someone who has decided to hold it together for the next 60 seconds and will cry later when it's safer. Vay came out behind her. He had the surgical blade in his right hand, held downward, not threateningly. Held the way someone holds a thing they've been holding and forgotten to put down. One of the MPs said something direct and quiet, and Vay set it on the doorframe ledge with the careful deliberateness of a man whose hands were not entirely steady. He looked at Emily. She had expected something in that look, defiance or pleading or the specific blankness of someone who has given up. What she saw instead was exhaustion. The comprehensive exhaustion of a person who has been holding a structure up through force of will for a long time and has just put it down, and all the weight of it is settling through them at once. "The rest of the files are in the bottom drawer," he said. "There's a false back. Radner didn't find them." He didn't know about the false back. Calloway was already moving through the doorway with one of his people. Vay looked at Emily one more time, and then he let the MP take his arm, and that was the last time she looked at his face, because she turned back toward the stairwell and the floor below and the man on the gurney who was still waiting for his CT. Boops. She was back in the trauma bay at 3:51 p.m., and Hale was still there, which meant the imaging run had been delayed, which meant either the tremor had changed or the situation upstairs had caused Terrence to hold position. Osei met her at the doorway with the expression of someone who has revised their assessment twice in the last 20 minutes. "The tremor stopped," Osei said, "about 8 minutes after you went upstairs. I've been monitoring. The intracranial pressure indicator has been stable." She paused. "I still want the imaging, but the urgency level has changed. Delayed bleed that resolved spontaneously? Or a vasospasm that released? Or the original reading had artifact components we couldn't isolate?" Osei pushed her glasses up. "The honest answer is I don't know yet, which is why we're going to imaging in the next 30 minutes regardless." Emily nodded and went to Hale's side. He was awake, more thoroughly awake than he'd been at any point since his arrival, which was either the best sign or a sign worth watching carefully. His eyes tracked her entry and he waited while she ran her own quick check. Pupil response, grip comparison left to right, the specific question she'd been asked to monitor. Left grip was stronger than it had been an hour ago. She did not show her reaction to that. "Vay?" he asked. "In custody. He's talking." "Radner?" "Still being located." She looked at him steadily. "The physical files in Vay's office, Radner didn't get everything. Calloway's team has what's left." Hale absorbed that. Something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, more like a man doing arithmetic and arriving at a number that is still short, but is less short than it was. "Is it enough?" I don't know. That's not my part of this. Fair, he said. He looked at the ceiling. The tremor. You noticed. It's hard not to notice your own hand shaking. He said it without self-pity, more like noting a mechanical fault in a vehicle. Is it going to be a problem? We don't know yet. That's what imaging is for. She leaned against the bed rail. You've been awake for most of the last 2 hours. How's your head? Pressure. Behind the left eye. It comes and goes. She relayed that to Ose with a look, and Ose was already documenting. Has anyone told you what happens now? Emily asked him. From the federal side. Calloway gave me a basic outline before he went upstairs. Debrief, full testimony, protective custody until the case is formalized. He paused. Standard. He said it like someone who had navigated protective custody before and had opinions about the experience. And Radner? His jaw tightened slightly. Radner has more resources than Vey. He's had longer to plan for a contingency, which means if he's not already in custody, Calloway knows that. Calloway's good, Hale said, but Radner's been building an exit for 18 months. That's what the financial trail showed, where the money was going. Not just personal account diversification, infrastructure, the kind of thing you build when you know the window will eventually close, and you want to be on the other side of it when it does. Emily thought about that, about a man who had already taken files and walked out of a building before anyone arrived to stop him, about the exits Calloway had covered, and the exits he might not have thought of because he hadn't had access to 18 months of contingency planning. I need to tell Ferris what you just said, she said. I know. His voice was flat. Go. She went. Ferris was in the hallway with her phone at her ear and a second agent, a man who had arrived with the larger vehicle and whose name Emily didn't know, working a laptop balanced on the nurse's station counter. Emily caught Ferris's eye, and Ferris held up one finger without interrupting her call. Emily waited. The call ended. Ferris turned to her. Radner's badge last activated at the parking structure on the east side at 1447, Ferris said. We have the car. It's still there, which means either he left in a different vehicle or he's still in the building. Hale says he's been building infrastructure for 18 months, financial structures that suggest he planned for contingency. That's not someone who leaves in a car registered to his own name. Ferris looked at the agent with the laptop. Pull the contracted services logs for the building. Deliveries, maintenance, external vendor access since this morning. The agent started typing. There's something else, Emily said. Hale mentioned the financial trail showed where the money was going. He has more information about Radner's preparation than he's given you yet. He was managing his own energy upstairs, giving you what was immediately actionable, and holding the broader picture until he could think more clearly. Ferris looked at her. How do you know that? Because it's what I would do, Emily said, and because when I asked him about Radner just now, he gave me detail he hasn't given Calloway. He trusts the room when he's had time to read it. We need to go back in there. He's going to imaging in the next 30 minutes. You have a window before that. Keep it clean. Don't push. Let him structure it. He'll give you more if he's leading than if he's answering. Ferris studied her for a moment with the expression of someone revising a prior categorization. You've been doing this all day, she said, reading the room, managing the information flow, knowing when to push and when to wait. Emily said nothing. That's not nursing, Ferris said. That's not just combat medicine either. It's pattern recognition, Emily said. You develop it when the cost of getting the pattern wrong is high enough. Ferris held her gaze for another second. Then she moved toward the trauma bay door. Come in with me. He responds better with you in the room. The second conversation with Hale lasted 19 minutes. Emily stood near the monitor and didn't speak much because she didn't need to. She had been right about his structure, right about the fact that he had been rationing his disclosure based on his read of the room. With Ferris sitting across from him, no table between them, no recording device visible though they both knew one was present, he spoke differently than he had with Calloway. More sequentially, more completely. He described the financial infrastructure Radner had constructed. 3 shell entities, 2 of them incorporated in states with light disclosure requirements. One of them, a medical consulting firm that had a legitimate client list, and a secondary function that the client list was designed to obscure. He described the specific routing by which procurement fraud payments had moved, not directly to Radner, never directly, always through the consulting firm's operational accounts, and then out through a distribution structure that looked like normal business payments. He described the account at a regional bank under a subsidiary name, and he gave Ferris the account number from memory, which he delivered with the specific absence of expression of someone reciting something they had memorized deliberately for exactly this kind of room. He described a property, not a residence, a commercial unit, a small industrial space, registered under the consulting firm's name in a town 40 minutes from Harwick. He had never been there, but in the documentation he had reviewed before the accident, that address had appeared 3 times in connection with the physical infrastructure of the operation. If he has somewhere to go that isn't his car and isn't his home, Hale said, that's where. Ferris was already on the phone before he'd finished the sentence. The imaging team arrived at 4:28 p.m., and Osei oversaw the transfer personally. Emily walked alongside the gurney through the corridor and watched Hale's face for anything that shifted. Pain indicators, cognitive changes, the specific micro-expressions of neurological distress that were different from garden-variety discomfort. He was quiet in transit. He watched the ceiling pass above him with the self-contained patience of a man who had learned to exist in situations where he was not in control of what happened next. She stopped at the imaging suite door because she didn't have clearance to go further, and there were now enough people with appropriate credentials that her presence on the corridor outside wasn't necessary. She stood at the door and watched the gurney disappear through it, and then she stood there for another 30 seconds, not doing anything in particular. The day had been running since 6:12 in the morning when she had looked at a medication order on a chart and said something about it. That was 9 hours ago. She was still in her scrubs from that shift. She had not eaten anything since the coffee she hadn't finished in the canteen before the first ambulance arrived. Her feet hurt in the specific way that nursing shoes addressed imperfectly, and her left shoulder had developed a tension across the top of it from the posture she'd been holding in the trauma bay for hours. None of that had mattered while it was happening. It mattered now, slightly, in the way that physical reality asserts itself during the pauses between things. She leaned against the wall in the corridor outside imaging and closed her eyes for 30 seconds and let her body catch up with the morning. When she opened them, Pruitt was standing 10 feet away. The hospital administrator looked different from the version of herself that had appeared in the trauma bay doorway with Bosworth in his notepad. That version had been performing control. This version was not performing anything, which made her look older and more human and considerably more tired. "Ms. Hart," she said. "Ms. Pruitt." They stood with 10 feet of corridor between them for a moment. The imaging suite hummed faintly behind the closed door. "The suspension," Pruitt said. "I've been advised by our legal team and by the federal agents that the basis for the suspension is being reviewed." She paused. "In light of the circumstances." "I was told that this morning," Emily said, "by Ferris." "I'm telling you myself." Pruitt held her gaze. "I should have looked more carefully at the complaint before I acted on it. That's the part that's on me. Vay had standing to file the complaint, and I processed it without—" She paused again, not searching for a word, deciding whether to use the honest one. "Without sufficient scrutiny." "He's your chief of surgical services. That's a significant position." "Yes," Pruitt said. "It is." So, she didn't say anything else that would have made the moment feel cleaner than it was, and Emily respected that. An apology that was also an excuse for itself wasn't worth much. This at least was just a statement of what had happened, without the insulation of justification. "What happens to the hospital?" Emily asked. Not accusatorially, genuinely. "That depends on what the investigation reveals about institutional knowledge." Pruitt's voice was measured. "If it can be demonstrated that the conduct was contained to specific individuals and that the governance structures were circumvented rather than complicit, we have a path through. If Radner's position on the board created a systemic exposure," she left the sentence there. "He restructured the credentialing system," Emily said. Pruitt closed her eyes briefly. "I know. 18 months ago. I know." She opened her eyes. "I approved the restructuring. I was presented with a regulatory compliance rationale, and I should have asked more questions about who was going to have access under the new system." Emily said nothing. There was nothing useful to add to that. "You're still an employee of this hospital," Pruitt said. Whatever the review concludes, that's the baseline until something formal changes it. She paused. I'd like you to remain available to the care team for Captain Hale's case, if you're willing. I'm already here, Emily said. Yes, Pruitt said. You are. She nodded once and walked back down the corridor. The CT results came back at 5:40 p.m. No bleed, no significant intracranial pressure accumulation. The left temporal contusion from the original injury showed bruising consistent with the mechanism of trauma, but the margins were clean and there was no evidence of expansion. The tremor and the pressure indicator changes had been, in Osei's phrasing, a pressure event, a temporary response to the cumulative physiological stress of the day, now resolved. Not nothing, but not what it could have been. Hale was returned to the trauma bay, which had been upgraded to a private room in the interim. Smaller, quieter, with a door that closed and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard instead of the ambulance bay. A concession to the reality that he was no longer in acute crisis and was also a man who needed to exist in a space without the foot traffic of an emergency department. Emily was in the room when the results were delivered. She stood near the window and listened to Osei explain the findings in the direct, unsugar-coated language that she consistently used. Here's what we found. Here's what it means. Here's what we watch for over the next 24 hours. Hale listened without interrupting. When Osei finished, he asked two questions, specific, clinical, the questions of someone who had heard difficult medical information before and knew which details actually mattered. And Osei answered them and then left to write her notes. The room was quiet. Good news, Emily said. It wasn't a question, just an acknowledgement. Good news, he agreed. He looked at the courtyard through the window. There was nothing particular in the courtyard. Some benches, a planted area that was between seasons. What time is it? Almost 6. You've been here since before 6 in the morning. I have. That's a long shift. I've had longer, she said, which was true. There had been days in the field that made this one feel simple by comparison, and she had thought about that several times today in the moments when the day had felt too large to hold. Comparison was a useful tool when the comparison went in the right direction. His eyes moved from the window to her. What made you say the word? This morning, when no one else was doing anything. She thought about it, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer had more than one layer and she wanted to give him the honest one. I recognize the pattern in your hand, she said. The movement. I'd seen it once before in someone who'd been through the program, and I knew that if the word worked, it would tell me whether you were reachable. And if you were reachable, everything else was still possible. And if it hadn't worked, then we would have been where the 15 doctors already were, she said. Which was not nothing, it was just not enough. He was quiet for a moment. Delray Okoye, he said. She went still. How do you know that name? He was in my unit, for one rotation. He looked at the courtyard again, before I moved to the role I was in when all of this started. He told me about you. Said there'd been a nurse on one of his field rotations who had the right instincts for the work even when the work was past what nursing was supposed to be. Emily said nothing. He said he'd explained the protocol to her because he trusted her to use it correctly if something happened to him. Something happened to him, she said. I know, Hale said. I know it did. They were quiet together for a while. The courtyard was losing light. Somewhere in the building, the shift had changed, and the evening version of Iron Ridge Medical Center was moving through its routines, and none of the people in those routines knew yet what the day had contained. Her phone rang. Ferris. She answered. We have Radner, Ferris said. The industrial property. He was there. He hadn't left yet, still moving materials when our team arrived. A pause. He's in custody. Emily exhaled. Okay. There's something else. Ferris's voice had a different quality now. Not the compressed urgency of the day. Something more deliberate. In the materials he was moving, there's a list. Names, payment records, individual level documentation. It goes beyond Vey. It goes beyond Radner. There are 6 names on the document that we're going to be working through for the next several months. Are any of them in this hospital? No. The hospital exposure appears to have been limited to Vey and Radner. A brief pause. I want you to know that Captain Hale's formal cooperation, the account number, the property address, the financial structure, is what put our team at that location in time to intercept him. Without the specific information, Radner walks out tonight, and we spend 6 months trying to find him. Another pause. That came from Hale, and Hale was conscious and verbal because of what you did this morning. Emily looked at Hale. He was watching her. She did not tell him what Ferris had said. Not yet. She would tell him, but not yet. Not in the way of someone managing information, but in the way of someone who understands that some things land better when the moment is right for them. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Ferris. She ended the call and stood with the phone in her hand and looked out at the courtyard that was going dark and thought about a 6:12 a.m. decision to say something about a medication order and the chain of things that one decision had pulled along behind it through the course of a single day. Then her phone rang again. Unknown number. She answered it. Not Ferris this time. Not Calloway. A voice she didn't recognize. Older, male, with the particular cadence of someone who is accustomed to conversations being on their terms. "Ms. Hart," the voice said, "my name is Whitmore. I'm the Inspector General for the Department of Defense, Office of Investigative Services. I've been briefed on today's events at Iron Ridge." Emily waited. "I understand you have a service record with certain redacted components," Whitmore said. "I'd like to discuss those components with you, along with a proposal regarding your involvement in the ongoing investigation." She looked at Hale. He was watching her face, and something in the quality of his attention told her that he had heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand the general shape of what was happening. He gave a single small nod. Not instruction, not advice, just acknowledgement. The nod of someone who has been in rooms like this and knows what a door sounds like when it opens. "I'm available," Emily said into the phone. "Tell me when." The call with Whitmore lasted 47 minutes, which was longer than Emily had expected and shorter than it probably should have been given what he covered. He was direct in the way of someone who had spent decades in institutions where indirectness was a resource people hoarded. He told her that the investigation into the defense procurement fraud had been active for 14 months before today, not stalled, but limited by the specific gap that had existed between the digital evidence and anything that could be physically corroborated. Radner had understood that gap and had structured the operation around it deliberately. The physical documentation recovered from the industrial property in Weston, the town 40 minutes from Harwick, had closed the gap. 6 names on a payment record, 4 of them connected to a procurement office inside the Department of Defense, 2 of them connected to private contractors who had supplied substandard field medical equipment to forward-deployed units over a 30-month period. 3 soldiers had died in incidents where equipment failure was a documented contributing factor. Another 11 had sustained injuries that proper equipment would have mitigated. Whitmore told her those numbers in the same direct voice he used for everything else, and she heard them land in her chest the way numbers like that always landed. Not as statistics, but as people, as specific weights, as the kind of thing that stayed. He told her what her redacted service record contained and why it had been redacted, which was the first time anyone in an official capacity had confirmed any of it directly. The 14 months had not been routine medical support. She had been attached to an intelligence-adjacent unit running health and status assessments on assets in environments where conventional medical access didn't exist. The classification was a formality by now. The unit had been restructured and the mission parameters had changed, but the formality had never been lifted, which meant that for 3 years at Iron Ridge Medical Center, she had been a former combat medic with a record that stopped in a suspicious place and a skill set that had no official explanation. She understood now why Vey had been able to process his complaint against her quickly. A nurse with a partial history and an incomplete file was easier to dismiss than one whose record told a full story. Whitmore did not apologize for the redaction. He explained it and then moved on, which she preferred. The proposal he outlined was straightforward in structure and complicated in implication. A consultancy role, formal, with a cleared status that would allow her to continue nursing while also being available for case-specific advisory work where her combination of clinical and field experience was applicable. It was not a reinstatement to military service. It was not an intelligence role. It was something that didn't have a clean category, which was, she thought listening to him, probably the most honest description of what she had always been. She said she would think about it. Whitmore said that was the right answer and that she should take the time she needed, and then he said one more thing before he ended the call. He said that the 3 soldiers who had died had families, and that those families would eventually be told, through appropriate channels, in appropriate language, that an active investigation had reached a conclusion, and that the conclusion included accountability. He said that process would take time and would be imperfect and would not fix the thing that could not be fixed. But it would happen. She said she understood. She stood in the corridor outside Hale's room for a few minutes after the call ended and let the weight of the day settle through her. Not processing it. There was too much to process in a corridor at 6:15 in the evening, just letting it be present without trying to organize it into something manageable yet. Then she went back inside. Hale was discharged from the ICU on day 3 and transferred to a private medical facility with federal oversight for the remainder of his recovery. In the 48 hours between the transfer and the press conference that nobody at Iron Ridge had been told was coming, several things happened in sequence that Emily learned about through Ferris, through Calloway, through a brief call from Osei, who had apparently been briefed directly by the hospital's legal team. Malcolm Vey was charged on day 2. The charges were read in federal court and covered conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, tampering with a federal witness, and criminal endangerment of a patient. That last charge specifically referencing the medication order and its documented potential to cause death in a patient with Hale's neurological presentation. He did not fight the arraignment. His attorney entered a not guilty plea as a formality, and then, according to Ferris, there were discussions about cooperation that were moving in a particular direction. Stuart Radner was charged the same day with a longer list that included everything Vey faced plus wire fraud, money laundering through the consulting firm's accounts, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Radner did fight it, immediately, loudly, through attorneys who issued a statement to 3 news outlets within 6 hours of the arrest, asserting that the evidence had been obtained improperly and that their client would be fully exonerated. The statement was professionally written and completely undermined by the fact that Radner had been arrested in the process of moving physical evidence from a property registered under a shell company, which made the improperly obtained argument a difficult posture to sustain. On day 3, the hospital's parent health system announced that Stuart Radner had been removed from the governance board pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The announcement used language that was careful not to constitute a formal acknowledgement of guilt, while also not constituting a defense. Pruitt issued a separate statement that was shorter and more direct. Iron Ridge Medical Center was cooperating fully with federal investigators and had initiated an independent audit of all administrative access changes implemented in the preceding 24 months. Emily read both statements on her phone in her apartment, which she had returned to the previous night for the first time in what felt like a longer period than 2 days. She made coffee that she actually drank this time, standing at her kitchen counter in clean clothes, and thought about the fact that 2 days ago she had been handed a suspension notice by a 23-year-old who couldn't hold eye contact, and now she was reading institutional statements about an investigation she had materially shaped. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and quietly certain about a few things she had not been certain about before, and something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it that she recognized the neighborhood. The ceremony at Fort Ashcroft was not what she had imagined, primarily because she hadn't imagined it at all. The call from Calloway had come on day 5. He explained that Captain Hale had formally requested, through channels that Calloway described with the specific language of someone who found the channels slightly cumbersome but respected the process, that Emily be present at a unit-level recognition event at Fort Ashcroft the following week. It was not a public ceremony in the sense of media attendance. It was attended by approximately 60 people, Hale's unit members, his commanding officers, several federal investigators, including Ferris and Whitmore, and a small number of people whose institutional affiliations were not announced. Emily drove herself. She had considered asking someone to come with her and then decided against it, not because she wanted to be alone, but because this felt like something she needed to arrive at under her own terms. Fort Ashcroft was 2 hours north of Harwick, through country that went from suburban to agricultural to something that had no particular category. Flatland, long sight lines, the kind of landscape that felt honest in its indifference to the people passing through it. She drove with the radio off for most of it and thought about Delray Okoye, who had stood in a field station somewhere that didn't exist on any map she'd ever been given, and explained a classified recovery protocol to her with the patient specificity of someone who trusted her to hold the information correctly. She had held it for 7 years. She had used it once, on a man she had never met, in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday morning when she had a suspension notice folded in her scrub pocket. She thought that would probably be enough to satisfy him. She thought he would have found the whole thing somewhat absurd and somewhat exactly right, which was how he had approached most things. The ceremony was held in a building that was not a ceremonial hall in any formal sense, a large briefing room reconfigured with chairs, at the edge of which someone had arranged a modest refreshment table that suggested military logistics applied to social occasions. Emily arrived and was greeted by Calloway, who shook her hand with the directness of someone who had moved past the formal register into something more human, and by Ferris, who nodded at her with the particular economy of a person who communicates primarily through precision. Hale was standing near the front of the room. He was in uniform. She had not seen him in uniform before. The field version had been stripped on the gurney, and the 3 days after that she'd seen him in a hospital gown and then civilian clothes. The uniform changed the geometry of him somehow, made concrete the things she had known abstractly about what he was and what he had done before the morning he arrived on a gurney at Iron Ridge. He walked toward her without a limp, which she noted as a clinical fact and then let go of as a clinical fact because this was not a clinical context. He looked like someone who had been through something significant and had come out the other side of it still standing, which was not the same as being unchanged by it. The left side of his face carried the residue of the temporal contusion, mostly faded, slightly visible, the kind of mark that would probably be gone in another week. "You drove yourself," he said. "I did." Calloway offered to send someone. "I know." She looked around the room. "This is not what I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Something with more—" She searched for the word. "Ceremony." "This is the ceremony," he said. "We don't do the other kind for things that aren't for public consumption." He looked at her steadily. "You're not comfortable with this." "I'm not uncomfortable. I just don't know what role I'm supposed to be playing in it." "The same one you've been playing all day," he said. "The only one you know how to play." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, and they stood there for a moment in the particular companionable quiet of two people who had established enough shared history to make silence functional. The event began without announcement. Someone simply began speaking, and the room gathered itself around the speaking. A colonel whose name Emily didn't catch spoke about the investigation in terms that were clear without being specific: the outcome, the accountability, the implication for the people whose deaths had not yet been explained to anyone. He spoke about what it took for that accountability to happen, and what it cost the people who made it happen, and the fact that those two things were not always measured in the same currency. Then Hale spoke. He was not a man who performed things, and his speech had none of the cadence of prepared remarks. He spoke like someone working through something in real time that he had thought about in private but hadn't fully resolved yet. He talked about the accident that wasn't an accident, and the hospital room, and what the preceding months of investigation had looked like from the inside. The accumulation of documentation, the careful movement toward a position where he had enough to be credible and survive what came after being credible. He talked about lying on a gurney in a trauma bay with 15 people in the room and none of them reaching him. And then someone said a word, he said. One word, to someone they'd never met who was unconscious, who 15 physicians had already given up on. Not because they were sure it would work, because it was the next thing to try, and there was still a next thing to try. He looked at Emily directly. In my experience, that is the whole of what distinguishes the people who turn things around from the people who don't. Not skill, not resources, not being the biggest or the loudest or the most credentialed in the room. Just the willingness to do the next thing when other people have decided there isn't one. The room was quiet. Her name is Emily Hart, he said. She's a nurse. She was on the morning she came into that trauma bay, a suspended nurse, which tells you something about how institutions measure people and how consistently they get it wrong. Somebody in the room made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite anything else. Hale looked at Emily. She's also a decorated combat medic who served in conditions that most of the people in this room know about, and most people outside this room never will. She carried a piece of information for 7 years that she had no institutional reason to believe she'd ever need, and she used it at the exact right moment. That's not luck. That's character. And character shows up in context, not in credentials. Emily held his gaze. Her throat was doing something she would have preferred it not to do, which she managed by breathing through her nose and looking slightly to the left of his eyes until the moment passed. What followed was not a formal medal presentation. It was the kind of recognition that didn't have an object, which made it feel more substantial, not less. Whitmore spoke briefly about the clearance reinstatement and the formal acknowledgement of her redacted service record, using language that was careful and complete. Ferris spoke about the specific sequence of events in which Emily's presence had been determinative, the medication order she had flagged, the recovery protocol, the reading of Vay's behavior, the information she had relayed at the exact junctures that mattered. She presented it as a sequence of decisions, each one made on incomplete information, and each one correct not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the reasoning behind it was sound. Emily understood, listening to Ferris, that this was the part that mattered most. Not the acknowledgement of what she had done, but the naming of how she had done it. Because the how was the part that could be carried forward by the people in this room and by anyone who would eventually hear about any part of this day. Calloway, at the end, gave her a folder. Physical documents, her clearance reinstatement, the formal lifting of the service record redaction, and a letter on Department of Defense letterhead outlining the consultancy structure that Whitmore had described on the phone. It was not a perfect arrangement. It was complicated and involved layers of bureaucracy and would require her to navigate institutional structures that she had historical reasons to be skeptical of. It was also exactly the kind of work she was built for, which she had known since she was 24 years old in a field station and had figured out, without anyone telling her, that she was better at the work than the official structure had made room for. She took the folder, but the public reckoning came in stages, which was how these things always went, and which was probably more honest than a single dramatic moment would have been. Vay accepted a plea agreement 6 weeks later. The charges were reduced in exchange for full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the 4 individuals inside the Department of Defense Procurement Office. His medical license was revoked by the State Medical Board in a separate proceeding that took 8 weeks and arrived at the same conclusion the evidence had pointed toward since day one. He received a federal sentence of 11 years, which his attorney stated he intended to appeal, and which the federal prosecutor's office stated they were confident would be upheld. The hospital's press statement on the license revocation was 4 sentences long and contained no editorializing, which was its own kind of statement. Radnor's case moved more slowly because Radnor made it move slowly, which was what his resources bought him. But resources have limits when the physical evidence is as complete as what had been recovered from the Weston property. And by the 4-month mark, his legal strategy had shifted from aggressive defense to negotiated reduction. He was convicted on 7 counts, acquitted on 2 where the documentation was less direct, and sentenced to 19 years. His attorney's statement after sentencing was shorter than the one before it. Radnor himself said nothing in the courtroom when the sentence was read, which people who had been watching him throughout the trial said was the first time he had looked like someone who had run out of moves. The 4 procurement officials were handled separately, in proceedings that Emily didn't follow closely because they were outside the radius of what she needed to know. Ferris updated her on the outcomes in a single text message 3 months after the sentencing. All 4. Convictions on all primary counts. Families of the 3 soldiers were formally notified today. Emily read that text message in the break room at Iron Ridge, between a morning shift and a staff training session she was running in the afternoon. She read it twice and then put her phone in her pocket and finished her coffee and went back to work. The training program had been Pruitt's proposal and Emily's design, which was a combination that had required several uncomfortable conversations to arrive at, and had produced something better than either of them would have built independently. It was called the Integrated Emergency Response Initiative, a name that Pruitt had insisted on and that Emily had accepted because the name was less important than the content, and the content was a curriculum that brought military tactical medicine protocols into the hospital's emergency training program in a way that had not existed before. She ran the first session 6 weeks after the ceremony at Fort Ashcroft. 17 staff members, a conference room, a morning that started with her standing in front of people who knew her as the nurse who had been suspended and then unsuspended and who had been at the center of something that most of them knew only partial versions of. She did not explain herself. She did not recap the events of the day that had led to this room. She started with the first case study, a hypothetical patient with a presentation that required both clinical and situational assessment. And she asked the room what they saw, and someone answered, and she built from there. She was not a natural teacher in the performed sense. She did not make it entertaining. She made it precise and demanding, and she held people to the reasoning, not the answer, pushed back when someone arrived at the right conclusion through imprecise thinking, asked better questions when the room went too easily, along with a consensus that deserved pressure. By the end of the morning, something in the room had shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in movies, with people looking at each other in revelation. Just a quiet recalibration, the specific temperature change of a group of people who have been asked to think about something they thought they already knew and have discovered that they knew less of it than they assumed. At the end of the session, a young nurse named Petra, first year, 2 months out of her program, with the careful watchfulness of someone still learning how to read rooms, stopped Emily on her way out. "The part about incomplete information," she said. "The thing you said about acting on what you can see and staying alert to what you can't. Is that something you learned in the military?" "Some of it," Emily said. "Some of it I learned here. Some of it I learned in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday when I had a suspension notice in my pocket, and I did the next thing anyway." Petra looked at her. "Were you scared?" Emily thought about it. About 6:12 a.m. and a medication order and a choice to say something. About a trauma bay and one word and a man whose hand moved. About all the hours that followed and all the things she had not known and all the things she had done with what she had. "Yes," she said, "but scared is just information. It tells you the stakes are real. It doesn't tell you what to do." Petra nodded slowly. She looked like she was going to say something else and then didn't, which was the right call. Some things need to be taken away from a room and thought about before they turn into words. Emily picked up her folder and her coffee cup and walked out into the corridor, which was loud with the ordinary sounds of a hospital at midday. Monitors, voices, wheels, the specific human frequency of a place where people arrived in crisis and were, more often than not, sent back out the other side of it. She had been dismissed in this building. She had been handed a piece of paper designed to make her feel small and temporary and replaceable. She had stayed anyway, not because she was performing resilience or because she needed to prove something to someone, but because there had been a next thing to do, and she was the one in the room who could do it. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. The corridor was long, and she had somewhere to be, and she walked it the way she had always walked it. Not slowly, not performing certainty, just moving forward with the particular steadiness of someone who has learned that the ground holds as long as you keep putting weight on it. She had been the nurse everyone dismissed. She had also been the only one in the room who knew the word. And in the end, the word was enough to bring someone back from the edge, which meant the person who had carried it quietly for 7 years, in a record no one had been able to read, had always been more than what any piece of paper said she was.